Is this really happening right now? Calloway didn't break stride. He barely glanced down. The man on the floor of Terminal 3, kneeling beside an overturned luggage cart, paper scattered across the polished tile like something broken, was not his problem. James Calloway had a board meeting in 40 minutes and a car already waiting at arrivals, and the only thing standing between him and it was a moving walkway and 4 minutes of focused indifference. He stepped around the mess without slowing. The man on the floor looked up. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. Calloway looked away first. What James Calloway didn't know in that moment was that the man kneeling on the floor of Pearson International Airport had spent the last 11 years building something that was quietly holding up pieces of the same industry. Calloway was about to walk into a room and lecture people about. He would learn this, and when he did, it would not be comfortable knowledge to carry. Theo Baird had been awake for 22 hours. That was not unusual. What was unusual was that he had spent most of those hours on a connecting flight from Abuja to London to Toronto, carrying 2 laptops, a binder of research documents he'd been reading by overhead light somewhere over the Atlantic, and a rolling suitcase that had developed a wobble somewhere around the Dublin layover. The wobble was what had done it. Caught on a floor seam near gate C-47, spilled everything. The binder first, then the suitcase lid, snapping open, then the cascade. 3 years of annotated field research, grant receipts, USB drives. A photograph of his daughter tucked into the front flap that had skidded a full meter before stopping face down on the tile. He was gathering it all back up, quietly, methodically, the way a man gathers things when he is too tired for embarrassment, when the foot appeared beside him. Expensive shoes. The particular kind of unhurried movement that means someone who has never had to wait for anything. Then the foot moved around him and was gone. Theo picked up the photograph last, turned it over. His daughter, 9 years old, gap-toothed, standing waist-deep in the Athabasca River with her arms out, looked back at him from the laminate surface, perfectly fine. He tucked it back in the front flap. Then he zipped the binder closed, righted the suitcase, got to his feet, and walked toward the exit. He had a presentation in the morning. Theo Baird was 41 years old and worked out of a converted garage on the east side of Edmonton that he shared with a graduate student named Lena, a space heater that only worked at a specific angle and approximately 4,000 hours of recorded acoustic data from freshwater ecosystems across northern Canada. He had no university position. He had held one, briefly, at the University of Alberta. Adjunct temporary contract, the kind of appointment that universities hand out like umbrellas in a light drizzle, just enough to make you feel covered until it really starts coming down. The contract had not been renewed. The stated reason was budget. The real reason, which 2 people had told him off the record over the years, was that the department chair had found his research methodology unconventional, his conclusions uncomfortable, and his lack of interest in softening either of those things professionally inconvenient. So he had left, or been pushed out, depending on who you asked. He didn't talk about it much. What he talked about, when he talked at all, was the water, specifically, what was happening to it. The research Theo had spent 11 years conducting was not glamorous. It did not involve deep-sea expeditions or satellite imagery, or the kind of visual drama that fills nature documentary trailers. It involved wading into cold rivers with recording equipment and taking the same measurements, at the same sites, at the same times of year, season after season, year after year, until the data told you something that the data had no choice but to tell you. What his data said, in dense, peer-reviewed language that had appeared in 4 journals, cited quietly by researchers in Norway, Australia, and British Columbia, was that certain freshwater ecosystems in the northern boreal region were degrading at a rate that the existing regulatory models had not predicted and were not currently tracking. The degradation was silent. No visible die-off, no dramatic event. Just a slow, numerical drift in the acoustic signatures of the ecosystems. The particular sound profile of healthy water versus water that was losing the biological community that made it healthy. Most people, when he tried to explain it, nodded politely. and looked for a way to change the subject. The National Resource Innovation Summit, held every 2 years in Toronto, was the kind of conference where the right people were in the same room at the same time. Lena had found the call for presentations. Theo had submitted an abstract without expecting much. The acceptance email had arrived while he was knee-deep in the Mackenzie Basin in early September, and he had stood in the river reading it on his phone for a long time before wading back to shore. He had 11 minutes on second day, room 4B, not the main hall. He had flown anyway. The conference center attached to the Fairmont Royal York was the kind of space that felt designed to make certain people feel at ease and certain other people feel slightly out of place. Theo arrived the morning of his presentation in a jacket he'd bought 2 years ago for a funeral and hadn't worn since, carrying the binder and both laptops. He checked in at registration. The woman behind the desk handed him a lanyard and looked briefly at his name tag, then at him, then at the name tag again, in the specific way that meant she was running a search she couldn't quite complete. He thanked her and went to find room 4B. Room 4B held 43 chairs, a projector screen that pulled down slightly crooked, and, when Theo arrived, 11 people. Over the next 8 minutes, 3 more came in. Then 2 left for a session down the hall that someone mentioned was running a live demonstration of carbon capture modeling. That left 12. Theo set up his laptop. He adjusted the projector angle to compensate for the crooked screen. He placed his binder on the table and did not open it. He had not used notes in 3 years. He looked at the 12 people in the room. A researcher from AirCan with her reading glasses on. 2 graduate students who had been taking notes on everything all morning. A man from an energy consultation firm who had come in on the wrong floor and stayed because sitting down felt less awkward than leaving. A journalist from a trade publication who was there as a wild card. And, in the back row, James Calloway. Theo did not know who James Calloway was. James Calloway knew who Theo Baird was now, barely. His assistant had forwarded a conference agenda that morning with certain sessions flagged. Room 4B had not been flagged. Calloway had ended up there because his 10:15 panel had been moved to the afternoon, and he needed somewhere to sit for 20 minutes where he wouldn't be asked to talk to anyone. He was finishing a text message when Theo began. He did not look up immediately. The first 2 minutes of Theo's presentation were technical. The methodology, the measurement framework, the 11-year data set. Calloway kept his eyes on his phone. The researcher from AirCan leaned forward slightly. Then Theo played the audio. It was 60 seconds of recorded river sound, not narrated, not explained, just sound. The kind that most people, in an office, at a conference, with coffee cooling in a paper cup, would process as ambient background noise and move through without registering. But Theo had spent 11 years learning to hear what was inside it. He let it play, then paused it, and said quietly, without drama, the way you say something you've said to yourself so many times it has stopped needing performance. This is what a healthy watershed sounds like. The density of that low-frequency register is the acoustic signature of a functioning macroinvertebrate population. It's the sound of the bottom of the food chain doing its job. He clicked to the next file. This is the same site. 7 years later. He played it. The room was quiet for a moment after he stopped it. Not silent, the conference center sounds continued, the distant hum of the main hall, footsteps in the corridor. But inside room 4B, 12 people were briefly still. The sound in the second recording was cleaner, in the way that absence sounds clean. The low register was there, but diminished, as if the room had lost several instruments and was playing on with what remained, and only someone who knew what to listen for would notice that the music was missing something. James Calloway had put down his phone. He was looking at the screen, not with the particular engagement of someone who has been moved, not yet. More the involuntary attention of someone who has heard something and found themselves listening before they consciously decided to. His text message was still open. He hadn't sent it. Theo moved through the rest of the data. He was precise. He made no predictions he couldn't support numerically. He did not use the word catastrophe. He said, current trajectory, regulatory gap, rate of change inconsistent with existing models. Language that was careful and exact, and for exactly that reason, somehow more unsettling than alarm would have been. He finished in 9 minutes. 2 minutes under. He asked if there were questions. 3 hands went up. The researcher from NCAN asked 2 detailed, specific questions that led to a 4-minute exchange that the graduate students wrote down verbatim. The man from the energy firm asked something general that Theo answered without condescension. The journalist wrote something in her notebook. James Calloway did not ask a question. He sat in the back row while people filed out, and he looked at the projection screen where Theo's last slide, 2 waveforms side by side, one full and layered, one thin and reduced, was still displayed. Then he picked up his phone, opened a new message to his assistant, and typed 4 words, "Find out about him." Calloway Infrastructure and Resource Partners had been in operation for 27 years. James Calloway had taken over from his father at 34 and had grown it into one of the 10 largest resource development consultancies in Canada. The kind of firm that didn't appear on lists but appeared at every table that mattered. They had advised on pipeline routing, watershed boundary designations, federal resource allocation assessments. They had, at various points, held contracts with 4 provincial governments simultaneously. They also had a problem. The problem had been developing for about 8 months, and Calloway's team had been managing it with the particular approach that firms like his applied to inconvenient truths: careful language, strategic delay, and the quiet hope that the numbers would shift in a direction that made the whole thing easier to explain. The numbers had not shifted. What the numbers showed, in internal assessments that had not been shared externally, was that a set of resource development recommendations the firm had provided to 2 provincial clients 4 years ago had been based on environmental modeling that was, in the increasingly difficult-to-avoid language of Calloway's own senior analyst, materially incomplete. The gap in the modeling corresponded almost exactly to the regulatory blind spot that an independent researcher had been documenting in 4 peer-reviewed journals for 11 years. Calloway had read his own senior analyst's memo twice. He had asked 2 clarifying questions, both of which had been answered in ways he didn't particularly want to be answered. He had been sitting with the weight of it for 8 months, looking for a version of events that gave him a door out. He hadn't found one. And then he had walked into room 4B. The assistant found Theo Baird without difficulty. Independent researcher, Edmonton-based, 11 years of published freshwater acoustic monitoring data. Former adjunct at University of Alberta, contract not renewed 2018. No institutional affiliation. Peer-reviewed publications, 4. Citations, significant relative to the journal size. No LinkedIn. 1 outdated academic profile page, a personal website that had last been updated in 2021 and contained a photo of a man standing beside a river with recording equipment and a look on his face that suggested he was in exactly the right place. Calloway read the file on his phone in the back of a car on the way to dinner. He read it again at the restaurant. He was quiet enough over the meal that his business partner of 16 years asked him, at one point, if he was feeling all right. He said he was fine. He wasn't fine. He was doing the thing he had learned to do over 27 years of making decisions that other people then had to live with. He was mapping consequences, tracing lines from the present moment forward and backward simultaneously, the way you trace the origin of a crack in a foundation, not to understand the aesthetics of it, but to understand how deep it goes and what it's connected to. What it was connected to, he was beginning to understand, was this. A researcher he had stepped over on the floor of Pearson International Airport was in possession of 11 years of data that told a more complete and less comfortable story about the environmental impact of decisions his firm had made than anything his own team had produced. He put his phone face down on the table. "Order me the salmon," he said. "I need to make a call." The call went to voicemail. Theo did not answer numbers he didn't recognize. and he especially did not answer them at 9:47 on the evening of a conference day when he was already in bed at the hotel with his shoes still on and his binder open across his chest. The voicemail was from a man named James Calloway, who described himself as being in the resource development sector, who said he had been at the Room 4B presentation that morning, who said, and this was the part that made Theo sit up and take the shoes off and play it again, that he thought they might have some things to discuss. Theo sat on the edge of the hotel bed for a while after listening to it. Then he opened his laptop, typed James Calloway Resource Development Canada into a search engine, and read for 40 minutes. He called Lena. "You know that thing you said," he said when she picked up, "about how the research is only as useful as the room it gets into." "I say that every 3 weeks," she said. "Which time?" "All of them," he said. "I think I need to call this person back." "Ow! Who?" he told her. There was a pause. "Theo," Lena said slowly. "That firm, they're the ones who," "Yeah," he said. "I know." Another pause. "What are you going to say to him?" Theo looked at the waveforms on his laptop screen. 2 rivers, the same site, 7 years apart, one of them full and layered, one of them quietly losing what it needed to be itself. "The truth," he said. "Same as always." They met for breakfast in the hotel restaurant the following morning, 40 minutes before Calloway had to be somewhere else. Theo arrived first and was drinking coffee when Calloway walked in. They recognized each other from the conference, not from the airport floor. Calloway because he had looked up his photo. Theo because he had looked up everything else. Calloway sat down, ordered coffee, and said, "I owe you an apology." Theo looked at him. "At the airport yesterday," Calloway said. "I walked past you. You'd spilled everything." Theo was quiet for a moment. "I noticed. I know." Calloway looked at his coffee cup. He was not, Theo observed, a man who was practiced at this particular kind of conversation. He was managing it with visible effort, the way people manage things they've decided are necessary, but haven't made easy for themselves. "I'm not going to explain it away. I wasn't asking you to," Theo said. Calloway looked up. Something shifted in his face, not quite surprise, but the adjustment of a man recalibrating. "All right," he said. "Then I want to talk about the data." What followed was not a comfortable conversation. It was not designed to be. Calloway asked questions and Theo answered them directly, without softening, the way he answered all Stolpel questions, with the data, and what the data said, and what the data could not yet say, and the difference between those things. Calloway listened with the focused attention of a man who had decided sometime in the last 12 hours to stop being the kind of person who walked past things he didn't want to deal with. He asked about the regulatory gap. What specifically was not being tracked and why? He asked about the timeline. He asked about the relationship between the acoustic data and the biological assessments that the resource sector typically used for environmental approval processes. He asked about what it would take to build the monitoring into existing frameworks. Theo answered each one. At some point, the coffee was refilled. Calloway's schedule notification went off on his phone. He looked at it, silenced it, and said, "Keep going." They talked for 2 hours and 20 minutes. What happened next took 4 months, and it was not clean, and parts of it were genuinely difficult. Calloway commissioned an independent audit of the firm's 4-year-old environmental assessments. The audit was not something his board agreed to easily. There were 2 meetings that got loud, and one that got quiet in a way that was worse than loud. 3 senior advisors told him, in various registers of professional language, that this was not necessary, that the liability exposure was manageable, that they could issue clarifying statements and update the modeling going forward without looking backward. Calloway told them he wasn't interested in manageable. The audit took 11 weeks. It was conducted by a 3-person panel that included a federal environmental scientist, a regulatory specialist from British Columbia, and, at Calloway's specific request, over his legal team's specific objection, Theo Baird, who drove down from Edmonton with his binder and both laptops and did not charge a consulting fee, because he said the access to the firm's proprietary assessment data was worth more to his long-term research than any fee they could offer. The audit confirmed what Callaway had already begun to understand. The 2019 assessments had used modeling that did not account for the acoustic and biological data Theo's 11 years of field research had been quietly documenting. The gaps were not fabricated. They were not the result of bad faith. They were the result of nobody in the room at the time knowing that someone in a converted Edmonton garage had been measuring what the standard models weren't measuring. Nobody except the people who had declined to renew his contract at the University of Alberta in 2018. That detail came out in week 8 of the audit, when Theo mentioned it matter-of-factly to the federal scientist over lunch, not as an accusation, just as context. The federal scientist mentioned it in her notes. The notes became part of the audit record. The audit record became, several months later, through the particular mechanism of public accountability that serious institutions have when serious reports get filed with them, a different kind of story. Callaway issued a public statement in the 4th month, not through his PR team, not in the language his lawyers had drafted, revised and redrafted across 8 versions. He wrote it himself, in the evenings, over the course of a week, the same way he had once written the business plan for a company he'd built from 2 employees to over 200. In longhand first, then typed, then revised until it sounded like what he actually meant instead of what he wanted to mean. It said that his firm had relied on environmental modeling that was materially incomplete, that this was not the fault of the modeling teams, who had used the best available frameworks, that the best available frameworks had not included research that had been available for years, conducted independently, published in peer-reviewed journals, and systematically overlooked. That the firm was disclosing the full audit to provincial regulators and requesting a review of the affected assessments. That they had committed to funding a 3-year monitoring program using the methodology developed by an independent Edmonton-based researcher who had been doing this work without institutional support for 11 years. He did not say he was a changed man. He did not use the word journey. He said, "We had access to better information. We didn't look for it. That is on us, and I'm not going to dress it up as anything other than what it is." The response was not what his communications director had expected. She had prepared for backlash. She had a crisis protocol ready. She had 3 holding statements drafted for various likely outcomes. What she had not prepared for was the specific, slightly stunned quality of public response when a powerful institution says something true without hedging it into meaninglessness. The statement ran on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the Globe and Mail had contacted Callaway's office for a full interview. The Federal Ministry of Natural Resources had acknowledged receipt of the audit and issued a statement about initiating a review. A professor at Dalhousie University, whom Theo had never met but who had cited his work twice in her own research, published a piece in Policy Options about what the case illustrated regarding institutional funding gaps in independent environmental science. 43 researchers emailed Theo directly that week. Not all of them were positive. Some asked careful questions. Some asked pointed ones. A few asked whether they could send him their own data. Lena handled most of the responses because Theo was driving back from a site in the Northwest Territories and had, characteristically, not thought to mention he was going to be out of range. He called her from a rest stop outside High Level on a Thursday evening. "How bad?" he said. "It's not bad," she said. "Theo, read your email. I'm in a truck stop. When you get back then, read it." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the truck stop windows, the highway ran north through boreal forest that looked, in the late October dark, like something drawn with a single black marker against a gray sky. He had driven this stretch of road many times over the years, in different seasons, at different stages of the work. He knew what was in the watershed that ran parallel to it for the next 80 kilometers, because he had measured it every autumn for 9 years. He knew what it sounded like when it was healthy. He knew what it sounded like when it was not. "What does Dalhousie want?" he said. "She wants to know if you'd consider contributing data to a collaborative monitoring framework she's building. Federal funding, actual budget, she said, and I'm quoting here, that your methodology is the cleanest long-term acoustic baseline she's seen in 20 years of freshwater ecology research. Theo looked out at the highway. 20 years, he said. That's what she said. He was quiet for another moment. Tell her yes, he said. Already did, Lena said. The photograph of his daughter came out of the front flap of the binder around Christmas. When Theo finally reorganized his field research files and built a proper shelf for them in the converted garage, he framed it and put it on the desk beside the space heater, which had been fixed in November by a neighbor who turned out to have a background in HVAC and had been watching the angled space heater situation with professional discomfort for 2 years. His daughter, Mara, came to stay for the winter break. She was 9, gap-toothed, and had recently developed an interest in recording equipment after he'd let her wear the headphones on a site visit in September. She spent 2 days in the garage going through files, not understanding most of what she was hearing but stopping, every so often, at a passage she found interesting and playing it back. On the second day, she played the 2 recordings back to back, the healthy watershed and the compromised one. She listened to both of them twice without being prompted. They're the same river, she said. Same site, Theo said. Different years. She listened to the second one again. It sounds lonelier, she said. Theo looked at her for a moment. Yeah, he said. It does. She thought about this. Is it going to get better? He looked at the waveforms on the screen, the 2 shapes he had looked at more times than he could count, in grant applications and conference presentations and audit documents and late-night moments of discouragement that he had absorbed alone in this garage because there was no institution to absorb them for him. Some of it will, he said, if enough people stop long enough to listen. Mara looked at the screen for another moment. Then she put the headphones back on. She was going to be fine. The river, with enough attention and enough time, might be too. Whether you were someone who walked past things you didn't want to deal with, or someone who had been doing the work alone in a garage for 11 years, with a crooked space heater and a binder full of evidence. The sound was there. It had always been there. The only question was who was willing to stop moving long enough to hear it.